In this video, I'm going to talk to you about something called critical realism. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking critical realism sounds like a fake thing. Like, what is it? Why are we talking about this in a business class? Well, what critical realism is it's a framework that we can use to understand social systems. And this is a business class, and business classes focus on businesses, and businesses are social systems. So we need to have some tools and frameworks to help us make sense of social systems. So when we're looking at a framework to help us make sense of the world that we're operating in, we want a framework that helps us understand and make sense of our experiences in a productive way. We want a framework that helps us to see forces that are at play in the environment that can either help us do what we want to do or may prevent us from doing what we want to do. And importantly, we want a framework to help us take effective action. This framework should help us conceptualize the world that we live in such a way that we can start to make effective and meaningful strategies to take actions of some sort, right? So we have a whole bunch of different types of frameworks, or whole different types of lenses to view the social world. Researchers and social scientists have come up with many different types of frameworks to understand social systems. Now, all of these frameworks have like really crazy sounding names because they were created by researchers, and researchers want to sound fancy when they talk with each other. So some of these other lenses include things like post-structuralism, positivism, constructivism, critical theory, and there's like more. It's crazy, but you know what? In this class, we are going to focus on this framework called critical realism, right? The reason for that is that I believe that critical realism has some really useful tools to help us make sense of organizations, specifically business environments, of helping you understand what's going on in an organization that you're trying to operate in. So it has some really useful tools, so let's get into this. Now, critical realism asks you to imagine that there are different layers of reality. Now, these aren't real layers, they're not physical layers, but they're imaginary layers, right? So we want to kind of imagine that there's layers to the social reality that we see. So the very top layer of social reality is what we call the empirical domain. Now, in this top layer, this is where the most obvious stuff happens. This is what we see, this is what we experience, right? So when we're going about our lives in our organizations and we have experiences and things happen to us and we're like, whoa, something just happened to me. All of those experiences we say happen in what we call the empirical domain, right? Now, these experiences didn't just come out of nowhere. Something happened to make those experiences occur to us. Now, these events and actions that create these experiences, they happen a little bit deeper down in what we call the actual domain. In the actual domain, we have events that happen and actions that people take. And these events and these actions are what create the experiences that we have, right? Now, these events that happen and these actions that people take, again, don't just happen, in a vacuum. There are forces at play. There are forces deeper down that influence who can do what, okay? So these forces happen in what we call the real domain. So this is the deepest layer of social reality, right? So there are forces at play that influence who can do what. They give resources to certain people to do certain things, or they withhold resources from certain people to do certain things, right? So these forces, we give them a special name. We call them structures, right? So any social system is composed of structures, and these structures influence who can do what within that social system. Okay, now these again are not physical structures. Like, you can't stub your toe on one of these structures. They're imaginary. These are just a conceptual tool to help us understand and make sense of our environment. So there's these social structures that influence who can do what. Now, these structures are really important because they enable or constrain our ability to act. So these structures influence who can do what. So if you want to take an action in your organization, if you want to do something, if you want to make something happen, well, there are certain structures that might facilitate your ability to act, or there might be structures that prevent you from taking action, okay? So these are really important to try to understand and to try to see and make sense of what are the structures operating in my environment that might prevent me from acting or that I can use and leverage to help me achieve my goals, whatever they happen to be. Now, right now, all of this probably sounds pretty esoteric and kind of out there. So let's look at a real world example to try to make sense of how all of this fits together. Now, this example is taken from the textbook for this class, so you can look at it there. But right now we have this image where we kind of have, the real domain and the actual domain and the empirical domain kind of imposed on one another. So here we have a situation where the United Kingdom, at the time that this study took place, that the textbook describes, the United Kingdom had a labor force that was composed of low-skilled workers. And at the time, the government of the UK wanted to transition its labor force to a high-skilled workforce, right? So here in the actual domain, we have foreign investment and trade relations that gives the experience in the empirical domain of this desire to shift to the high-skilled, high-value-added manufacturing, okay? So that's the initial situation that we have. So the UK was working with these other countries and getting money from these other places, and so they could see what was happening elsewhere, and so they had this experience that they wanted to change. They wanted to shift their labor pool to be high-skilled, high-value-added. Now, let's look at the underlying structures of their ability to do this and to see what impact that had on the UK's ability to make this change. So in a moment here, I'm going to advance, and this is going to look a little bit messy, but we're going to make sense of it here. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this slide here. Let's just back up and sort of go at it just very slowly. At the very bottom left, in the real domain, we have this structure. Managers had no skill managing high-skilled workers. That's a structure. So remember, structures are these sort of imaginary things that even though they're imaginary, they're not physical. They have this real impact in being able to either help us do something or prevent us from doing something. So here we have like a group, the managers in the labor pool, they have no skills managing high-skilled workers. That's a structure. It's something that prevents the business from transitioning to high-skilled workers because the managers don't know how to deal with it, right? So if you follow the arrow up, what happens in the actual domain, the events that happen, the actions that happen, is that businesses developed wage systems and processes for low-skilled workers, right? And that makes sense. So you have this structure that managers don't know how to manage high-skilled workers, so they create actions and events that result in an organization that favors low-skilled workers. Now, because these organizations favor low-skilled workers, managers gain no experience managing high-skilled workers. So you see this feedback loop. Managers don't have skills managing high-skilled workers. Therefore, they create businesses that favor low-skilled workers. Because they create businesses that favor low-skilled workers, that reinforces the fact that their managers don't know how to manage high-skilled workers. They never gain that experience, right? If we move along the bottom, we also see that the labor pool was composed of low-skilled workers. So that's a structure. You cannot transition to a high-skilled workforce if no one in your labor pool has high skills. So that's a limitation, right? It's a limitation. It's a constraint. So there's a structure that's constraining the nation's ability to shift to a high-skilled workforce. So you see that this labor pool composed of low-skilled workers again results in these businesses that are created to facilitate low-skilled workers, right? And then if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you see that government policies and cultural attitudes favored low-skilled workers. So there's a culture in the nation that low-skilled work was good, You honored low skilled work, high skilled work wasn't honored. Government policies reinforce that. And so again, that is a structure that limits the nation's ability to shift to a high skilled workforce. Here, because you see, these policies and attitudes led to an education system designed to produce low skilled workers. And so, because we had businesses that favored low skilled workers, because we had education systems that favored low skilled workers, we had this experience that shifting to a high skilled workforce was really very difficult, right? So you can see this connection between structures. Structures limit people's ability to take action. Those actions result in the experiences that we have, okay? Now, you see some feedback loops here in the bottom here, right? You see some structures resulting in certain actions, and then you see those actions reinforcing those structures. And there's really a very important lesson to take away from that. That is this. Structures aren't separate from human activity. These are social structures in social systems. They didn't exist beforehand. We create them. And so if we can create social structures, we can change them. And so our actions, every action that we take in an organization, either reinforces the existing structures, or we can take action to change those structures, right? So, for example, if we have managers that do not know how to manage a high-skilled workforce, well, that's a structure that restrains our ability. However, we can take action. We can start to maybe hire managers from other countries. We can bring managers from other countries in who do have skills in managing high-skilled workforces. So we can take action. So we either take actions that reinforce the existing structures, or we can take action to change those structures. And there's power in that. There's power and insight in terms of figuring out how is it that we can act effectively in an organization by understanding this, right? So, critical realism, it does two things. One, it helps us understand our environment. It helps us understand the situation that we're in, because we have experiences. So we start with our experiences. We're in an organization and we have experiences. And then we can stop and think, and we can start to dig down and try to figure out what are the actions and what are the structures that led to those actions that have created the experience that I'm feeling, right? So it helps us understand what it is that's causing our experience. The second thing that this concept of critical realism does is it helps us to take effective action within our organization. If we want to take effective action, if we want to make something happen, first thing we need to do is we need to take stock of the structures existing within our organization. What are the structures in the organization that might resist my attempts to take my action? What are the other structures that I might be able to leverage and use to help me achieve my action, right? So we start with taking an inventory of the structures operating in our environment, and then we can create an action plan and start taking action to create the desired outcome that we want. So critical realism helps us understand the situations that we're experiencing, and it also helps us formulate and create strategies for action, which is really powerful. All right, so in this course, we're going to focus on 3 structures. There are way more than 3 structures. There's like probably millions of structures that might exist in the real world, but in this course, we're only going to focus on 3 structures. And the structures that we're going to focus on in this course are those 3 themes of wisdom. And you'll recall that those 3 themes of wisdom are values, rationality, and power. So these are structures. They allow us to take certain actions, or they prevent us from taking certain actions. So values, rationality, and power are the structures we're going to focus on in this course. So we're going to explore how do these structures, how do they operate? How do they act? How do they prevent certain actions? How do they enable other actions? So we're going to be talking all about those things at length. And it's really, as I said, if you've heard me say this before, it's fascinating, it's exciting, and I can't wait to get into it. So I'll see you in the next video.